A quiet mountain wind moves through the sleepy town of Redwood Hollow, the evening a war veteran finally returns home. His name is Jack Turner, and after years of war, he arrives with nothing but a worn-out truck, an old wooden house that hasn't been lived in for years, and the only partner who never left his side, a retired canine German shepherd named Rex. The house stands alone in the middle of a wide stretch of land that most people in town seem strangely eager to buy. Jack thinks all he has to do is fix the broken roof, clear the weeds, and start a quiet new life. But on the first night back, Rex begins acting strangely. The dog patrols the yard, growling toward the dark tree line, and digging near the old fence, as if he can smell something buried beneath the soil. Soon after, strangers begin showing up with polite smiles and expensive offers, insisting Jack should sell the property and move away. When he refuses, the warnings start getting darker. What Jack doesn't know yet is that the land around his forgotten home is hiding a dangerous secret, one powerful people are willing to threaten, burn, and lie to protect. And the only reason that secret is about to come to light is because one loyal canine refused to ignore what was buried beneath the ground. If you enjoy powerful stories about loyalty, courage, and finding a new purpose after war, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. A cool coastal breeze drifted through the quiet mountain town of Redwood Hollow, Oregon, carrying the scent of pine trees and damp earth. Early autumn clouds hung low above the forested hills, and the narrow road leading into town curved between tall redwood trees that had stood there for centuries. The town itself was small, just a handful of wooden storefronts, a gas station, a diner, and a general store that had likely served the same families for generations. On that gray afternoon, a dusty pickup truck rolled slowly down the road. The truck was old, a 1999 Ford F-150, its dark green paint faded and scratched by years of use. Mud clung to the wheel wells from long drives across back roads and highways. The engine hummed steadily as it passed the wooden sign at the edge of town. "Welcome to Redwood Hollow." Behind the steering wheel sat Jack Turner. Jack Turner was 38 years old, a recently returned American war veteran who had spent nearly 12 years serving in overseas combat operations. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, with the lean, hardened build of someone who had spent years carrying heavy gear across rough terrain rather than lifting weights in a gym. His shoulders were broad, but slightly slumped from exhaustion. A faint scar crossed his left eyebrow, and another thin line marked the side of his jaw, souvenirs from years that had not been easy. Jack's hair was dark brown, cut short in a practical military style, though it had grown slightly uneven since leaving the service. His face carried light stubble, and the skin around his eyes had the weathered tone of someone who had spent more nights under open skies than inside comfortable rooms. But it was his eyes that revealed the most. They were a calm steel gray, observant, cautious, and quietly tired. The kind of eyes that never stopped scanning the world around them. Jack had once known exactly what his mission was. Now, he wasn't so sure. Beside him in the passenger seat sat the only companion who had remained constant through it all. A large German shepherd lifted his head as the truck slowed. The dog's name was Rex. Rex was a 7-year-old retired military canine, a powerful German shepherd with a thick sable coat, dark black along the back, fading into warm brown along his chest and legs. His ears stood tall and alert, and his amber eyes moved constantly, studying everything outside the window. Years of training had shaped every movement he made. Rex had served as a military canine detection and patrol dog, trained to track scents, detect explosives, and protect his handler during high-risk missions. His body was strong and muscular, though faint gray hairs had begun appearing around his muzzle, signs of a dog who had already lived through more danger than most. Despite his age, Rex carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't bark unnecessarily. He watched. And when Rex paid attention to something, it usually meant it mattered. The truck turned onto a narrower dirt road leading away from town. Tall grass brushed against the sides of the vehicle as Jack drove slowly toward the edge of the forest. After a few minutes, the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was. Jack eased his foot off the gas. The truck rolled to a stop. In front of him stood the house. It had once been a simple wooden family home, nothing fancy, just a 2-story structure built from pine boards, with a small porch and a stone chimney. Now it looked like something time had almost forgotten. The roof sagged along one side, where several shingles had fallen away. One corner of the porch railing had collapsed inward. 2 of the front windows were cracked, and another had been completely shattered. Tall weeds had overtaken the yard. Grass grew nearly to Jack's knees. The wooden fence surrounding the property leaned crookedly in several places, where posts had rotted. Jack stared at it quietly. "This is it, huh?" he muttered under his breath. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Rex leaned forward, pressing his nose against the open window. He sniffed the air. Then the dog jumped down from the truck before Jack had even opened the door. Rex landed lightly in the grass and began walking slowly across the yard. His nose moved constantly, back and forth, left to right. Jack stepped out of the truck and stretched his stiff shoulders. He looked around the property again. This house had once belonged to his parents, 10 years ago, before everything changed. His father had built the porch himself. His mother had planted the small apple tree near the fence. Now the tree stood taller than the roof. Jack let out a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly, "guess we've got some work to do." Rex continued exploring the yard, but something about the dog's behavior caught Jack's attention. Rex wasn't just wandering, he was searching. The German Shepherd moved toward the far edge of the property where the forest began. Near the back fence, the ground sloped downward toward a narrow stream that ran through the trees. Rex stopped. He sniffed the ground carefully. Then he looked toward the trees. His ears lifted slightly. Jack walked over. "What is it, boy?" Rex sniffed again. Then he circled a small patch of ground near the fence before moving farther toward the stream. Jack watched him for a moment. "Probably rabbits," he said, but Rex didn't seem convinced. After a few seconds, the dog finally relaxed and trotted back toward the porch. Jack shook his head slightly. "Still on duty, huh?" The dog's tail wagged once. Later that afternoon, Jack drove back into town to buy supplies. The Redwood Hollow General Store sat on the corner of the main street. It was a simple wooden building with faded paint and a creaking screen door that rang a small bell whenever someone walked inside. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 30s. Her name was Emily Carter. Emily Carter was the town's elementary school teacher, though she also helped run the store part-time for her uncle who owned the building. She was about 5'6" with a slim build and shoulder-length auburn hair that she usually tied loosely behind her head. A few freckles dusted across the bridge of her nose, and her green eyes carried a warm curiosity about the world around her. Emily had grown up in Redwood Hollow and had never really left. Most people in town described her as patient and kind, the kind of teacher who stayed late after school to help struggling students. But those who knew her well also knew something else. Emily had lost her older brother in a military deployment years earlier. Since then, she carried a quiet respect whenever she met someone who had served. The doorbell chimed as Jack stepped inside. Emily looked up. Her eyes briefly moved from Jack's worn boots to the calloused hands resting on the counter. Then she noticed Rex. The German Shepherd sat calmly beside Jack's leg. "Well," she said with a friendly smile, "that's a beautiful dog." Jack nodded. "His name's Rex." Rex's ears twitched when he heard his name. Emily leaned slightly over the counter. "You new in town?" Jack hesitated for a moment. Then he replied simply, "Just moved back." She tilted her head. "Oh? Where?" Jack glanced toward the hills behind town. "Old Turner Place." Emily blinked. "That house?" Jack gave a small nod. "Yeah." For a moment, Emily looked surprised. "That place has been empty for years." Jack shrugged lightly. "Not anymore." Emily smiled softly. "Well, welcome home then." While Jack gathered supplies, nails, lumber, cleaning tools, two older men near the back of the store spoke quietly. Their voices carried just enough for Emily to hear. "That land out there is being bought up," one of them whispered. "Company from Portland, Northridge Development. They've already bought half the forest." Emily frowned slightly but didn't say anything. Jack paid for his supplies and walked back outside. As the truck pulled away from town, Rex sat quietly in the passenger seat again. But when they reached the old house, the German Shepherd immediately jumped down and ran toward the back of the yard. The dog stopped near the stream again, his nose lowered to the ground. He sniffed slowly, carefully. Then he looked toward the trees. Jack carried a stack of wooden boards toward the porch. He glanced over his shoulder. "You find something interesting back there?" Rex didn't bark. He simply stood there, watching the forest, as if the land itself was trying to tell him something. Jack set the boards down beside the porch steps. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. For the first time since returning home, Jack allowed himself a small breath of hope. Maybe this place could still become something again. Maybe broken things could be rebuilt. He looked out across the property, then toward the forest behind the house. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's start fixing this place up." Rex remained near the stream, still watching. Morning arrived slowly over Redwood Hollow the next day. A pale autumn sun pushed through thin layers of gray clouds, casting long golden light across the forest that surrounded the old Turner property. The air smelled of damp leaves and pine resin, and a cool breeze rustled through the tall grass that had taken over most of the yard. Jack Turner stood on a ladder beside the house, one hand gripping a loose wooden beam near the edge of the roof. The wood creaked softly under his weight as he leaned forward, inspecting a section where several shingles had rotted away. From up there, he could see almost the entire property, the crooked fence line, the tall weeds stretching toward the tree line, and the narrow stream glinting faintly beyond the back field. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence only rural towns could hold. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his flannel shirt and hammered another nail into place. Below him, Rex moved steadily through the yard. The German Shepherd worked with the same calm precision he had shown during military patrols. His nose skimmed the ground, pausing occasionally near the fence or along the dirt path leading toward the woods. Even when Jack wasn't watching, Rex treated the land like an area that needed to be inspected. Years of canine training didn't disappear just because the uniform was gone. Jack climbed down from the ladder and stepped back to study the roof. "Not perfect," he muttered to himself, "but it'll hold." He stretched his shoulders and walked toward the fence carrying a small toolbox. As he replaced a broken post, he noticed Rex standing unusually still near the back corner of the yard. The dog's ears were upright, his body angled toward the forest. His nose hovered just inches above the dirt road that ran behind the property. "What did you find?" Jack asked. Rex sniffed again and stepped slowly along the road. Jack crouched beside him. That's when he saw it. Tire tracks, fresh ones. The pattern was clear in the soft dirt, deep ridges from large off-road tires leading into the woods. Jack frowned. The road behind the house wasn't used much anymore. Most locals drove along the main road that curved around the hills. "Probably hunters," Jack said quietly, though the explanation didn't feel entirely convincing. Rex followed the tracks a few steps farther before returning to the yard. The dog seemed uneasy, but he didn't bark. Jack straightened and carried his toolbox back toward the porch. He had just begun measuring a damaged section of railing when the distant sound of an approaching engine drifted across the clearing. A vehicle rolled slowly up the dirt road leading to the house. Jack set the measuring tape down. A black SUV came into view, polished and spotless, looking strangely out of place against the rough landscape. The engine shut off. A tall man stepped out. The man walked toward the porch with calm, deliberate steps. His name was Victor Kane. Victor Kane appeared to be in his early 40s, standing around 6'2" with a broad, athletic build. His hair was dark and neatly styled, streaked lightly with gray near the temples, in a way that suggested controlled confidence rather than age. He wore an expensive charcoal jacket over a pressed button-up shirt, and his boots were polished enough to reflect the afternoon sunlight. His face was sharp and symmetrical, with a square jaw and thin lips that held a permanent hint of a smile. But his eyes, cold gray and calculating, studied everything around him with the quiet precision of someone used to negotiating power. Victor Kane was the type of man who made friendly conversation sound like a business contract. "Afternoon," he said smoothly, as he reached the bottom of the porch steps. Jack stepped forward. "Can I help you?" Victor glanced briefly at the house before returning his attention to Jack. "You must be Jack Turner." Jack didn't answer immediately. Victor extended his hand. "Victor Kane." Jack shook at once, firm but brief. Victor nodded toward the house. "You've got quite a project here." Jack leaned against the porch railing. "Working on it." Victor took a slow look around the land, his gaze drifting across the yard, the forest, and finally toward the stream behind the property. "Beautiful land," he said thoughtfully. Then he continued. "My company recently began development plans in this area. We're creating an eco-resort, cabins, hiking trails, nature lodges, something that could really put Redwood Hollow on the map." Jack folded his arms. Victor continued calmly. "The thing is, your property sits directly in the middle of the development zone." Jack remained silent. Victor smiled politely. I'm sure you understand that coordinating land ownership can get complicated. My company has already purchased most of the surrounding land. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. We'd like to make you an offer. Jack didn't move. Victor placed the envelope on the railing. There's enough there for you to buy a much nicer home anywhere you want. Jack looked down at the envelope but didn't pick it up. Rex stepped forward quietly and sat beside Jack. The German shepherd's amber eyes locked onto Victor. Victor glanced at the dog. Impressive animal. Military canine, Jack replied. Victor nodded once. Well trained. Jack lifted the envelope and handed it back. Not interested. Victor's smile didn't disappear, but it tightened slightly. You should think about it, he said. Jack shook his head. I already did. Victor studied him for a moment longer. Then he gave a small shrug. Well, he said calmly, the offer will remain open. He turned and walked back toward the SUV. Before getting in, Victor paused and looked back at the house. Redwood Hollow is going to change a lot in the next year, he said. Sometimes it's easier to move with progress than stand in its way. The SUV drove away, leaving a faint trail of dust along the road. Jack watched it disappear between the trees. Rex let out a low rumble in his throat. Jack scratched behind the dog's ear. Yeah, he muttered. Something about that guy. Later that afternoon, Jack drove into town again for additional supplies. The garage at the edge of Redwood Hollow belonged to Frank Dalton, the town's only mechanic. Frank Dalton was a large man in his early 60s, with thick arms shaped by decades of lifting engines and hauling equipment. His gray beard spread across his jaw like steel wool, and deep lines around his eyes revealed a lifetime of working outdoors. Despite his rough appearance, Frank had a reputation for being patient and quietly generous with anyone who needed help fixing a vehicle. Jack parked outside the garage. Frank wiped grease from his hands with an old rag. You're the Turner kid, Frank said. Was, Jack replied. Frank nodded toward the hills. Didn't think anyone would move back into that place. Jack leaned against the truck. Why not? Frank hesitated. Then he shrugged. Used to be an old mineral mine up in those woods years back. Closed down a long time ago. What kind of mine? Mixed deposits. Copper mostly. Maybe some other things. Frank tossed the rag onto a workbench. After the mine shut down, the land just stayed empty. Jack frowned slightly. Why? Frank shrugged again. Some places just stay quiet for a reason. That evening, the sun dipped behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the Turner property. Jack stacked lumber near the porch while Rex walked slowly toward the back field. The German shepherd stopped again at the dirt road behind the house. The tire tracks were still there, but now there were more. Fresh ones. Rex followed them several yards into the trees, before stopping and looking back toward Jack. The forest beyond the stream seemed darker than the rest of the land. Jack walked halfway across the yard and watched the dog standing near the tree line. What is it this time? He called. Rex didn't bark. He simply stared into the woods, as if waiting for something to come back. The nights in Redwood Hollow grew colder as autumn settled deeper into the mountains. Pine branches swayed softly in the wind, and the forest that surrounded the Turner property seemed darker after sunset, as if the trees themselves were closing in around the land. Jack Turner stood on the porch one evening with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. The porch light cast a small circle of yellow across the old wooden steps, leaving most of the yard hidden in shadow. From somewhere deeper in the forest, an owl called out into the darkness. Rex sat beside him, perfectly still. The German shepherd's ears twitched slightly. Jack noticed it immediately. "What do you hear, boy?" he asked quietly. At first there was nothing. Then Jack heard it too. A faint engine, somewhere far beyond the trees. The sound drifted through the valley for only a moment before fading again. Jack frowned. That road behind the house wasn't supposed to have traffic this late. Rex stood up slowly. The dog's posture changed. His body lowered slightly as he stepped down from the porch and began walking toward the back field. Jack followed. The grass brushed against his boots as he crossed the yard. The moon hung low above the forest, casting a pale silver glow over the stream that ran behind the property. When they reached the dirt road, Rex lowered his nose to the ground and began tracking. The tire marks from earlier that day were still visible, but now there were fresh ones layered over them. Jack crouched and touched the dirt. Still loose, still recent. "These weren't here this afternoon," he murmured. Rex continued moving forward. The German shepherd followed the tracks across the narrow wooden footbridge that crossed the stream. On the other side of the water, the forest grew thicker. Old logging trails twisted between the trees, many of them long forgotten. But Rex moved with purpose. The dog stopped several yards ahead and pawed lightly at the ground. Jack approached. The soil near the base of a pine tree had been disturbed, not by animals, by something heavier. The dirt looked recently turned, though someone had tried to cover it with fallen leaves. Rex began digging. Jack watched for a moment before kneeling beside him. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what you've got." He brushed away loose soil with his hands. The edge of metal appeared beneath the dirt. Jack froze. He cleared more soil until the curved top of a container became visible. It was a steel drum, old but heavy. A faded yellow warning label clung to the side, partially torn but still readable. The symbol was unmistakable. Hazardous material. Jack's stomach tightened. "What the hell?" he whispered. Rex backed away slightly and gave a low growl. Jack quickly pushed dirt back over the barrel, covering it again. His instincts from years in the military were already working through the situation. Someone had buried that drum there recently, and someone didn't want it found. The wind moved softly through the trees. Jack stood slowly and looked deeper into the forest. Rex remained alert beside him. Neither of them liked what they had just discovered. The next morning, Jack drove into town earlier than usual. The sky was pale blue, and sunlight filtered through the redwood trees along the road. Redwood Hollow looked peaceful as always. Quiet storefronts, a few trucks parked along Main Street, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the diner. But Jack's mind was still on the metal drum buried in the forest. He parked outside the small brick building that served as the town's sheriff's office. Inside sat Sheriff Daniel Brooks. Daniel Brooks was a man in his mid-50s, with broad shoulders and a calm, steady presence that came from decades of law enforcement work in rural communities. His hair was mostly gray now, cropped short above a deeply lined face that carried the patient expression of someone who had spent years settling disputes between neighbors and handling problems quietly before they became serious. He wore a tan sheriff's uniform and wire-rimmed glasses that rested low on his nose as he read paperwork behind his desk. Brooks looked up when Jack entered. "You new around here?" the sheriff asked. Jack stepped forward. "Name's Jack Turner." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Turner? Old place up near the North Ridge?" "That's right." Brooks leaned back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" Jack hesitated before speaking. "I found something out in the woods behind my property." Sheriff Brooks folded his hands. "What kind of something?" "Buried barrels." The sheriff's expression didn't change. Jack continued. "They've got hazardous warning labels on them." Brooks rubbed his chin. "Old mining waste, maybe." Jack shook his head. These were freshly buried. For a moment the sheriff studied him quietly. Then he gave a small shrug. "That land's seen all kinds of things over the years. Abandoned equipment, scrap metal, leftover mining debris." Jack leaned forward. "This wasn't old debris." Brooks remained calm. "Did you see anyone burying them?" "No." "Any vehicles?" "Just tire tracks." The sheriff sighed. "I'll make a note of it." Jack realized what that meant. Nothing would happen. "Look," Brooks said in a measured tone. "Redwood Hollow doesn't usually deal with big environmental problems. Most of the time, it's broken fences or cattle wandering across property lines." Jack nodded slowly. "I understand," but he didn't believe it. Later that afternoon, Jack stopped by the general store again. Emily Carter stood behind the counter sorting through a stack of school papers. When she saw Jack walk in, she smiled. "Back again already?" Jack leaned against the counter. "Got a question for you." Emily tilted her head. "About what?" "The old mine outside town." Her expression changed slightly. "You talked to Frank, didn't you?" Jack nodded. Emily pushed a few papers aside. "I looked into that place once." "You did?" She nodded. "Town library has old records about it." Emily Carter had always been curious by nature. As a teacher, she encouraged her students to ask questions about everything, from local history to science experiments. Her brother's death during military service had shaped her personality in quiet ways. It had made her more protective of the community and deeply respectful toward people like Jack, who carried the weight of war. "The mine shut down about 25 years ago," she explained. "Why?" Emily hesitated. "There was a chemical leak." Jack frowned. "What kind of chemicals?" "Industrial solvents. Mining operations use them to process certain minerals." Emily lowered her voice slightly. The company closed the mine after contamination was discovered in the soil. Jack thought about the buried drum. Did they clean it up? Emily shook her head slowly. The company declared bankruptcy a few years later. Jack leaned back. So the land was just left there. Pretty much. That evening, Jack returned home before sunset. Rex met him at the truck. The German shepherd immediately began walking toward the forest again. Jack followed. This time, Rex didn't stop at the buried barrel site. Instead, he continued deeper into the woods. Branches snapped softly under their boots and paws as they moved through the undergrowth. After several minutes, Rex stopped at the edge of a narrow trail. The path was barely visible. Overgrown grass covered most of it, but deep tire tracks cut through the dirt, fresh ones. Jack crouched and studied them. "These are from trucks," he said quietly. Rex looked down the trail. The road twisted between the trees and disappeared over a hill. Jack stood there for a long moment. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains. Shadows stretched across the forest floor. Somewhere far away, an engine echoed again through the valley. And suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. Someone was still using these woods. Someone was still burying something in the ground. And no one in town seemed willing to talk about it. A thin layer of fog hung over Redwood Hollow that morning, drifting slowly between the tall redwood trees like pale smoke rising from the earth. Autumn had settled deeper into the valley, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet pine needles and cold soil. The Turner house stood quietly at the edge of the forest, its aging wooden walls glowing faintly in the early sunlight. Over the past few days, the place had already begun to change. Broken boards on the porch had been replaced, several sections of fence had been reinforced, and the tall grass in the yard had been cut down enough to reveal the shape of the land again. Jack Turner stood near the side of the house with a hammer in one hand and a measuring tape clipped to his belt. His flannel shirt sleeves were rolled up, exposing forearms marked by old scars from years of military service. Rex lay a few yards away, near the porch steps, watching the surrounding property with the quiet patience of a trained working dog. Even while resting, the German shepherd's ears twitched at every distant sound. Jack was adjusting a loose section of gutter when the rumble of an approaching engine broke the morning silence. The sound came from the same dirt road behind the house. Jack turned. A dark SUV rolled slowly across the clearing and stopped near the front gate. Jack recognized it immediately. The driver stepped out. Victor Kane. Victor looked exactly as he had during their first meeting, perfectly composed, dressed in a tailored charcoal jacket and dark jeans that somehow remained spotless despite the dirt road. His movements were calm and deliberate, as though he already expected the outcome of every conversation before it even began. His sharp gray eyes scanned the property again, lingering briefly on the new repairs Jack had made to the house. Rex stood up the moment Victor stepped out of the vehicle. The dog didn't bark, but he moved closer to Jack, positioning himself slightly in front of him. Victor noticed. "That dog doesn't seem to like me very much," Victor said with a faint smile. Jack rested the hammer on the porch railing. "He's got good instincts." Victor walked a few steps closer, stopping just outside the gate. "I came to check if you had reconsidered our offer." Jack leaned against the post. "I haven't." Victor studied him quietly. "You're putting a lot of work into a house sitting on land you won't be able to keep." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that a threat?" Victor chuckled softly. "Not at all, just practical advice." The wind moved gently through the clearing, rustling the leaves of the tall trees behind them. Victor continued calmly. "Development like ours brings investment, tourism, jobs. Redwood Hollow will look very different soon." Jack crossed his arms. "Then build around me." Victor's polite expression tightened for just a fraction of a second. "That won't be possible." Jack didn't respond. Victor sighed lightly, as if disappointed. "Well," he said, turning back toward the SUV, "I suppose we'll speak again." Before opening the car door, he paused and looked back once more at the house. "You should think carefully about what it means to stand in the way of progress." The SUV drove away, leaving the clearing silent again. Jack exhaled slowly. Rex gave a quiet growl under his breath. "Yeah," Jack muttered. "I heard it too." Later that afternoon, Jack drove into town again, this time with a specific purpose. He parked outside the general store and stepped inside carrying a small notebook filled with rough sketches of the tire tracks and the location of the buried barrel Rex had discovered. Emily Carter stood behind the counter again. Her auburn hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and she wore a dark green sweater over a simple blouse, the kind of practical clothing that teachers in small towns often preferred. Her expression brightened when she saw Jack enter, though she immediately noticed the serious look on his face. "You look like someone who didn't sleep much," she said. Jack placed the notebook on the counter. "I need some help." Emily leaned forward curiously. "What kind of help?" Jack explained everything he had discovered: the buried barrels, the hidden road in the woods, the conversation with Victor Kane. Emily listened carefully without interrupting, her green eyes narrowing slightly as the pieces came together. When he finished, she folded her arms. "So they're dumping something out there." "That's what it looks like." Emily glanced toward the store window before lowering her voice. "If that's true, you're going to need proof." Jack nodded. "That's what I was thinking." Emily tapped her finger thoughtfully against the counter. "My cousin installs security systems for farms outside town. Motion cameras, trail cameras." Jack looked at her. "You think we could get some?" Emily smiled faintly. "Give me a few hours." By late afternoon, Emily arrived at the Turner property in her small blue pickup truck. The bed of the truck carried a toolbox and 3 small motion cameras sealed in plastic packaging. Emily climbed out of the vehicle, brushing dust from her jeans. "You're lucky," she said. "He had extras." Together they walked the property while Jack explained where he believed vehicles were entering the forest. Rex followed them closely, occasionally running ahead to sniff the ground. Emily handed Jack a camera. "These run on batteries and record when motion is detected." Jack nodded. "Perfect." They installed one camera facing the dirt road behind the house, another near the stream crossing, and a third hidden along the trail Rex had discovered deeper in the forest. As the sun began lowering behind the mountains, Rex suddenly stopped again near the tree line. The dog's nose pressed against the soil. He began digging. Emily looked over. "What's he doing?" Jack walked over. Rex scraped away dirt until the top of another metal drum appeared beneath the ground. Emily's expression changed instantly. "That's not old mining waste," she whispered. Jack brushed dirt aside carefully. The faded hazard symbol on the drum was identical to the first one he had discovered. Rex backed away slightly, ears pinned forward. Jack stood slowly. "That's 2. Over the next hour, Rex led them to 2 more disturbed patches of soil hidden between the trees. Each one contained another buried drum. Emily stared at the ground in disbelief. "Jack, that's not just dumping." "No," Jack replied quietly. "That's a whole operation." Night fell quickly over Redwood Hollow. By the time Emily drove back toward town, the forest had turned into a dark wall of shadow behind the Turner property. Jack stood on the porch looking across the land. The cameras were set. The barrels were mapped in his notebook. He was finally starting to understand what might be happening out there. Rex lay beside the porch steps. The German Shepherd lifted his head suddenly. His ears shot upright. Jack frowned. "What is it?" Rex stood. A sharp bark cut through the quiet night. Jack smelled it a moment later. Gasoline. His eyes snapped toward the side of the house. A dark, wet line glistened along the wooden boards beneath the window. Footsteps crashed through the trees behind the yard. Someone was running. Then a small flame appeared at the end of the gasoline trail. Fire spread along the wood with frightening speed. "Damn it!" Jack grabbed the nearest shovel and began throwing dirt across the growing flames. The fire crackled loudly as sparks climbed up the wall of the house. Rex barked fiercely toward the forest. Jack shoveled dirt again and again until the flames finally died down, leaving only black smoke drifting into the night air. For a long moment, Jack stood there breathing hard. The smell of gasoline and burned wood lingered around the house. Rex returned and stood beside him. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck. "They tried to burn us out." The forest behind the property was silent again, but Jack knew something now that he hadn't known before. Someone out there was afraid of what he might discover, and they were willing to destroy the house to stop him. The morning after the attempted fire arrived gray and heavy over Redwood Hollow. Smoke stains still marked the lower boards of the Turner house, where the flames had briefly caught the night before. Jack Turner stood in the yard, examining the damage, while the cold mountain wind pushed clouds slowly across the sky. The wooden siding was blackened, but intact. thanks to the dirt he had shoveled over the gasoline trail before the fire could spread. The porch railing smelled faintly of smoke, and several charred patches marked the grass near the wall. Rex moved slowly around the yard, sniffing the ground where the intruder had fled. The 7-year-old German Shepherd carried himself with the quiet seriousness of a working dog that understood something dangerous had happened. His sable coat shimmered faintly in the pale sunlight as he traced the scent trail toward the tree line. Jack watched him for a moment. "You almost saved the whole place again," he said quietly. Rex paused near the edge of the woods, ears forward, then returned to sit beside Jack as if waiting for the next command. Later that morning, Emily Carter arrived in her pickup truck. She stepped out quickly, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid, and her expression tense when she saw the burn marks on the house. "Oh my God," she said, walking closer. Jack leaned against the porch post. "Could have been worse." Emily knelt beside the blackened boards and ran her fingers lightly over the charred wood. "They tried to burn it down." Jack nodded. "Looks that way." Emily stood and looked toward the forest. "Then we don't have much time." Jack understood what she meant. If the people responsible for the dumping were desperate enough to start a fire, they were probably worried about something, and desperate people made mistakes. That night, Jack prepared carefully. The trail cameras Emily had helped him install were already active, but Jack decided he needed to witness whatever was happening firsthand. The sky darkened early as thick clouds rolled across the mountains, and a steady wind whispered through the tall trees around the property. By midnight, the forest had become a shadowed maze of black trunks and rustling branches. Jack and Rex moved quietly through the woods behind the house. Jack carried a small pair of binoculars and an old digital camera with a zoom lens he had used during military deployments. Years of training had taught him how to move silently across uneven ground, and Rex followed with the same quiet discipline he had used during patrol missions overseas. They reached the ridge overlooking the narrow trail Rex had discovered earlier in the week. Jack crouched behind a fallen log. "Stay," he whispered. Rex lay beside him, eyes fixed on the dark road below. The wind carried the distant sound of an engine. A few minutes later, 2 headlights appeared between the trees. A large cargo truck rolled slowly along the trail, its tires crunching over gravel. Another truck followed behind it. Jack lifted the camera. The truck stopped near the same clearing where Rex had found the buried barrels. 4 men climbed down from the vehicles. One of them stepped into the light of a handheld flashlight. Jack recognized him immediately, Victor Kane. Even in the dim light, Victor looked composed and confident. His expensive jacket had been replaced with a heavy work coat, but his posture remained the same, upright, controlled, the posture of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than following them. He stood near the trucks while the other men opened the cargo doors. 2 workers rolled metal drums down a ramp. The men looked like hired laborers, thick-shouldered, rough-faced individuals wearing heavy gloves and worn work boots. One of them was a stocky man in his late 30s, with a shaved head and a thick beard that covered most of his jaw. His name, Jack would later learn, was Darren Cole, a former construction worker known in nearby towns for taking dangerous jobs that paid well. Darren grabbed a shovel and began digging a hole near the tree line. Another worker rolled a steel drum toward him. The yellow hazard symbol gleamed briefly under the flashlight beam. Jack felt his stomach tighten. He zoomed in with the camera. Every movement was recorded. Victor stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the operation with calm indifference. "Make it quick," he said. The workers lowered the drum into the hole. Another followed, and another. The entire process took less than 20 minutes. Jack continued recording everything. License plates, faces, voices. Victor finally nodded once. "That's enough for tonight." The truck started their engines again and disappeared down the trail. For several minutes, Jack remained perfectly still. Then he slowly lowered the camera. "Got you," he whispered. Rex looked up at him. Jack scratched behind the dog's ear. "Let's go." The next morning, Jack drove straight to the sheriff's office again. Sheriff Daniel Brooks sat behind the same desk, reading paperwork under the warm glow of a desk lamp. The older lawman looked up when Jack entered, his expression neutral. "You're back," Brooks said. Jack placed the camera and a small flash drive on the desk. "This time I brought proof." Brooks frowned slightly and inserted the drive into his computer. The video began playing. For the first time, the sheriff's calm expression changed. He leaned closer to the screen. The footage clearly showed the trucks, the workers digging, and Victor Kane directing the operation. Brooks removed his glasses slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "that changes things." Within hours, the footage was forwarded to the Oregon State Environmental Protection Division. By the following afternoon, several state investigators arrived in Redwood Hollow. One of them was Dr. Laura Bennett, an environmental scientist in her early 40s with short blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that constantly scanned the land around her. Laura Bennett had spent most of her career investigating illegal dumping cases across the Pacific Northwest. Her calm but direct personality made it clear she had very little patience for corporations that damaged natural environments. After examining the buried barrels, she spoke with Jack beside the stream. "This is industrial chemical waste," she said firmly, "and a lot of it." Sheriff Brooks crossed his arms. "Enough for criminal charges?" Laura nodded. "Absolutely." 2 weeks later, the arrests began. Victor Kane was taken into custody along with several workers from the dumping operation. Investigators traced the operation back to Northridge Development, the same company that had been quietly buying land around Redwood Hollow. Documents revealed the truth. The company had been secretly dumping toxic waste from multiple industrial clients in the abandoned forest to avoid expensive disposal fees. News of the scandal spread quickly through the small town. Emily Carter organized a town meeting in the school gymnasium to discuss protecting the surrounding forest. Nearly every resident of Redwood Hollow attended. Farmers, shop owners, mechanics, teachers, all of them packed the room to hear what had happened. For the first time, many of them realized how close their water supply had come to contamination, and who had stopped it. When Jack walked into the gym that night, conversations paused. People turned to look at him. Then, an older rancher near the front stood up. "That's the man who found it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Emily smiled from across the room. Rex sat beside Jack's chair, calm and dignified as always. One of the children in Emily's class approached cautiously and knelt beside the dog. "Is he the hero dog?" the boy asked. Jack laughed quietly. "Something like that." By the end of the meeting, the town council had voted unanimously to support the investigation and protect the surrounding forest from future development. For the first time since Jack returned home, he realized he wasn't standing alone anymore, and beside him, Rex sat proudly, the quiet canine who had started it all simply by refusing to ignore what was buried beneath the ground. Spring arrived slowly in Redwood Hollow. The long winter rains finally began to fade, leaving the forests washed clean and bright beneath wide blue skies. Fresh grass pushed through the soil around the Turner property, and wildflowers began appearing along the edges of the clearing. The tall redwood trees surrounding the land stood quiet and ancient as always, but the air now carried a new sense of life. Where once the land had hidden danger beneath the soil, teams of environmental workers now moved carefully through the forest. Several white trucks marked with the seal of the Oregon Environmental Protection Division stood near the dirt road behind Jack Turner's house. Workers in protective suits walked between flagged sections of ground, while large excavation equipment slowly removed contaminated soil from the buried drum sites Rex had discovered months earlier. Jack stood near the edge of the property, watching the operation. He wore a faded work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a worn baseball cap to keep the sun out of his eyes. The months of physical work repairing the house had returned strength to his shoulders and arms. Though the quiet seriousness in his steel-gray eyes remained, something about him seemed lighter now. Beside him sat Rex. The 7-year-old German shepherd looked just as alert as ever, though his posture was more relaxed than during the tense weeks of investigation. His sable coat shone under the sunlight as he watched the workers moving equipment across the clearing. A woman approached Jack from the cleanup zone. Her name was Dr. Laura Bennett, the same environmental scientist who had helped confirm the illegal dumping operation months earlier. Up close, she carried the calm professionalism of someone used to working in dangerous environments. Her short blonde hair was tucked under a safety helmet, and her sharp blue eyes reflected both intelligence and determination. She held a clipboard as she walked toward Jack. "Good news," she said. Jack glanced at her. "Finished already?" "Not entirely," she replied, "but we've removed most of the contaminated soil." She pointed toward the wooded area where several large machines were operating. "The remaining sections will be sealed and treated." The groundwater tests came back clean. Jack let out a slow breath. "That's a relief." Dr. Bennett nodded. "If you hadn't reported this when you did, Those chemicals could have leaked into the river valley within a year. Jack looked toward the forest.
And the company?
Still under investigation, she said. But Northridge development is finished. A faint smile crossed Jack's face. Rex wagged his tail once. By early summer, the cleanup crews finished their work. The forest behind the Turner property slowly returned to its quiet, natural state. Grass and young plants began growing again in areas where contaminated soil had been removed, and wildlife returned cautiously to the surrounding woods. But the biggest change came from the state government. After reviewing the investigation, Oregon officials made a decision that surprised many people in Redwood Hollow. The entire forest area surrounding the old Turner land would become a protected conservation zone. The new name appeared on a wooden sign installed at the entrance road: Redwood Hollow Nature Preserve. The land that had once been targeted for luxury development was now protected for wildlife and public hiking trails. Jack's property remained in the center of it. One afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Brooks drove up the dirt road in his patrol truck. The older sheriff stepped out slowly, adjusting his hat as he looked around the property. His calm face showed quiet approval at the repairs Jack had completed over the past months. The old house no longer looked abandoned. Fresh paint covered the siding. The porch had been rebuilt. A new fence surrounded the field. Brooks approached Jack, who was repairing a section of railing. "Well," the sheriff said, glancing around, "looks like you've turned the place around." Jack smiled slightly. "Took some work." Brooks nodded toward the preserve sign visible down the road. "State decided the land stays protected permanently." Jack leaned back against the railing. "That includes this house?" "Especially this house." The sheriff crossed his arms. "State officials think the place might serve a better purpose than just sitting here." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What kind of purpose?" Brooks looked toward Rex. "That dog of yours started something important." Later that month, Jack began working on a new project. The large field behind the house, once covered with tall weeds, was cleared and fenced properly. A long wooden structure was built near the barn, using lumber donated by several townspeople. Inside were training spaces, kennels, and small recovery rooms for injured animals. The new sign near the porch read, "Redwood Hollow, K9 Rescue and Training Center." Emily Carter stood beside Jack the day they installed it. Emily had become a constant presence at the property during the previous months. Her auburn hair now usually stayed tied back under a baseball cap, while she helped repair fences, organize supplies, and care for animals brought to the center. Though she still taught at the town's elementary school during the week, she spent most evenings working alongside Jack. The quiet determination in her personality had grown stronger since the investigation. Protecting the forest had become personal to her. "You realize," Emily said as she stepped back to admire the sign, "this whole place exists because Rex wouldn't stop digging." Jack chuckled softly. Rex sat nearby watching them, ears tilted curiously, as if he understood his name. The first rescue dog arrived only 2 weeks later. The animal was brought by Walter Briggs, an older rancher from outside town. Walter was a thin man in his 70s, with sun-weathered skin and a permanent stoop from decades of riding horses across rough farmland. His gray mustache twitched slightly whenever he spoke, giving him a thoughtful appearance, even when he was joking. Walter stepped out of his pickup truck, carrying a small mixed-breed dog wrapped in a blanket. "Found her near the highway," he explained. The dog inside the blanket was a young shepherd mix, barely a year old, with light tan fur and frightened brown eyes. Emily knelt gently beside the animal. "It's all right," she whispered. Rex approached slowly. The German shepherd lowered his head and sniffed the smaller dog carefully. Instead of barking or asserting dominance, Rex simply sat down beside her. The young dog relaxed almost immediately. Walter laughed quietly. "Well, I'll be," he said. "That dog of yours could train half the animals in this county." Jack smiled. "That's the idea." Over the following weeks, more animals arrived. Stray dogs found along highways, injured animals from nearby farms, even a few abandoned pets left at the edge of town. Rex naturally became the quiet leader of the training yard. Whenever a frightened dog arrived, Rex approached calmly and patiently, showing them through body language that the place was safe. His years of discipline as a military canine now served a different mission, teaching other dogs how to trust again. As the months passed, hikers and visitors began traveling to Redwood Hollow to explore the new nature preserve. Small businesses opened near the town center, and local guides began offering trail tours through the protected forest. The town that had once feared the land now thrived beside it. One warm summer evening, Jack sat on the rebuilt porch, watching the sun set over the preserve. The sky glowed orange behind the tall redwoods. In the field nearby, several rescued dogs ran happily through the grass, while Emily tossed a tennis ball across the yard. Rex lay beside Jack's boots. The old German shepherd rested his head on the wooden porch floor, content and calm. Jack reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You know something, partner?" he said quietly. Rex lifted his head slightly. Jack looked across the field where the dogs played. For a moment he remembered the first night he had returned here, how the house had stood broken and abandoned, how the future had seemed uncertain. Now the land was alive again, and so was he. "We've fought enough battles," Jack said softly. He looked down at the loyal dog beside him. "Looks like we finally found home." Rex placed his head gently against Jack's boot. The wind moved softly through the trees, and the house that once stood forgotten now echoed with barking dogs, laughter, and the quiet peace of a place that would never be abandoned again. Every once in a while, life brings us to a place that feels broken, a moment where things seem uncertain, where the future looks quiet and empty, much like that old house Jack returned to. But sometimes the places we think are forgotten are actually the places where something new begins. Jack believed he had come back to Redwood Hollow, with nothing but an old house and a loyal dog. What he didn't realize was that courage, patience, and loyalty can quietly change the world around us. One man who refused to walk away, and one faithful dog who refused to ignore what was hidden, protected an entire forest and gave a small town a second chance. In our everyday lives, we may not face dangers as dramatic as Jack did, but we all encounter moments where doing the right thing is not the easy thing. Sometimes it means speaking up when others stay silent. Sometimes it means protecting what is good, even when it feels like you are standing alone. And sometimes, just like Rex, it means staying loyal and listening carefully when something in your heart tells you that the truth matters. This story reminds us that purpose does not end when one chapter of life closes. A soldier can become a protector of nature. A forgotten house can become a place of hope. And even the smallest act of courage can lead to something bigger than we ever imagined. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Stories like this remind us that loyalty, kindness, and courage still exist in this world. I would also love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment in life where a difficult situation later became a blessing? Tell us in the comments. And if this message meant something to you, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss more stories about faith, courage, and second chances. Before you go, take a moment and comment "Amen" if you believe that even in our hardest seasons, God is still guiding our path and watching over us. May God bless you, your family, and everyone who is watching today.